Well, hello everybody and welcome to the fifth WebEx in our Virtual Academy of Large Scale Change programme. My name's Elaine Bailiff and I'm the co-lead for the Virtual Academy. I'll be your host today and I'll be very ably supported by two of my colleagues. They are Michael Anderson, who will be helping me with the chat box, and Claire Potts, who will be looking after all things for us technical in the background. We will be using the chat box and the animation tools today. So if you are going to use chat, can you please make sure that you select all participants before you put your message into the chat box, and then everybody on the WebEx today will be able to join in. We'll come to the animation tools in a little while when we get to that section of today's programme. Okay, so what are we looking at today? Well, today's session is going to focus on measurement for improvement, or as we now like to think about it, how to make better use of data. So I'm delighted that we're joined by two very esteemed colleagues today, Karen Haler, who works in the NHS Improvement team, and Karen is a Senior Improvement Analyst. You can see her biography in front of you on the screen now. And my colleague Alison Johnson, who's a Measurement and Evaluation Manager in the Sustainable Improvement team. Alison's bio really makes me laugh because apparently she likes to spend time in her garden or allotment digging holes. More on that later, maybe, Alison. Okay, so I'm going to move across now and hand the controls over to Alison and Karen, and over to you guys to take us through the session. Thanks, Alison. I think at the moment you're on mute, Alison, so you might need just to drop that off.
Thanks, Elaine. There are always technical difficulties with these things. Apologies. So as Elaine's already mentioned, the title for this is usually measurement for improvement, but I think both Karen and myself now prefer to talk about making better use of data because we think it's much more, it's a much broader context than we think about in terms of than traditional measurement for improvement. So the objectives for today is for us to, what we really want you to do is to help you think about how you use and present data. If all you do is go away and think differently about how you use and present data, you don't necessarily need to know about any of the other things on this list. If you just think differently, then we are very happy. So we're going to start by having a little look at something called statistical process control, which is which is not as scary as it sounds. And Karen will show you how that's used in improvement and capability work. I'll talk to you a little bit about describing the three phases of measurement and a little bit about outcome process and balancing metrics. And then I'll then talk to you a little bit about an approach that we've been using within sustainable improvement to use measurement as part of large-scale change efforts, which I think you will find interesting. So I'm just going to hand over now to Karen.
Thank you. It's a privilege to come and talk to you. I've never done a WebEx before, so if it goes horribly wrong, blame me. So I'm interested to know, and I'd like you to use your shout-out tool thing or your chat box to tell me how many of you are familiar with statistical process control. And if you're familiar, how confident are you about using it? Can you interpret a chart and use it effectively?
So we're getting a real blended feedback in the chat box on that one, Karen. And some people are saying, yeah, and people like Laura Sherwood are saying, no, not used it at all, and saying, nope, never heard of it. Others saying, yes, I'm confident. So you've got a really mixed audience today, Karen. We can draw on the wisdom of the crowd and some folk totally new to this.
Okay. Well, for those of you who are very familiar, I might be teaching you something you already know. And for those of you who are not familiar, let's think about how we can use data better to make better decisions. So in front of you on your screen, you'll see a couple of presentations of data, and this is very much where we are now, still with trust and how they present data, and even sadly with my own institution, NHS Improvement, we still tend to put data in tables and use RAG rating, and it's really not the best way to use data. Oh, just need to make it move down somehow. There we go. So why is that a problem? Well, if you use this sort of analysis and you display your data like this, you stand in danger of feeling that you need to say something about the data, writing a distracting commentary. So rather than focusing on what's really going on your system, you focus on the 1 month trend, the latest data point, really unhelpful. And then I'm sure, well, wave at me or do whatever you do in the chat box. If you've ever written or seen a commentary like this. It's an increase of 95.36 to 95.76. Do we really think that's an important improvement? Do we think that's a useful commentary? Is it just distracting? I'd venture to suggest that although we all do it, and I've done it many times myself, that's quite a distracting way to describe the data. And in fact, it's probably not a significant change. Right, so here's another presentation of data we often see. We call this the sea of green in our team, and we're very fond of it. And if you saw this data like this in a 170-page board report, you'd tend to think, nothing to worry about there then, and turn the page. If I show you another presentation of the same data, I'd like to know what your reactions are. So these are the same 4 lines of data, slightly longer time series, and you can see that this is telling a completely different story. In the third metric, which is IAPS treatment at 6 weeks, you can see that there's a real deterioration in that process. And it has, although it is still above the target, so it's still green on our summary chart, for months and months and months, it has been getting worse and worse and worse. And that's something, as a service manager, you'd want to know. So if we present our data like this as a sea of green, we miss that information. We should be acting already to do something to correct what's going on. So that's a more useful way of looking at the data. And there you are, that's the detail. You can see that all the way since August 16 to August 17, so for a whole year, there's been a statistically significant deterioration in the data, which you can only see if you plot the data over time. Come on, graph. I'm going to talk to you about a couple called John and Mary. John and Mary are a young couple. They live in, well, youngish couple. They live in London. Mary's got a new job with Sainsbury's, and she's just starting, and she's an analyst, so like me, she's a little bit anal, and she likes to record information. So she's decided that she's going to record every day the time she gets home from work, because this is useful information for her. She leaves work at 6 o'clock, and John's away golfing. So there you go. So she starts her new job, and on the first day, she gets home from work at 7:10. The next day, 5:27, etc., etc. You can see she gets home slightly different times every day, and that's absolutely fine. And you'd say, on average, she gets home around 7 p.m. Now, John comes back from his holiday, and he's quite a nice chap, really, and he works from home. So John decides that what he'd like to do is cook Mary's tea for her when she gets home from work, because he's been on holiday and that'd be a nice thing to do for her. So he says, Mary, what time do you get home from work? And she says, well, about 7 o'clock. So the first day, Mary gets home from work at 7:10. John is seriously pissed off about this. He's very unhappy because he said, I wanted to have dinner on the table, I wanted to have it beautiful for you, and you're 10 minutes early. Outrageous. The next day, of course, something similar happens. She arrives at exactly 7 o'clock. And he's like, oh, for heaven's sake, yesterday you got here at 10 to 7, I've made soufflés, they're spoiled, you're 10 minutes late, etc., etc. So you can see that John is really obsessed by exactly what time Mary gets home. Do you think that's useful? What are your reactions to that? Apart from the fact Mary's quite lucky to have a husband who cooks, but perhaps he's a little unhelpful. The truth is, John can cook you a souffle. Indeed. The truth is that what John is reacting to are tiny normal changes, what we call common cause variation. If we were saying to someone, what time do you get home from work? We'd probably say, well, I arrive somewhere between 7:15 and 7:45. There's a half an hour gauge. Sometimes I'm late, sometimes I'm early. It's about 7 o'clock. And if we put limits around that, any time in that range is normal variation. We know that in everyday life, there's normal variation. Unfortunately, in the health service, we sometimes react as if that's not true. We react as if a little change is very important. So So what could we do to help John and Mary? Well, we could put an SPC chart together with their data, and that's what we're going to talk about today. An SPC chart looks like this. So it's similar to the chart I just showed you. It has a mean that runs through the middle of the data. It has an upper and lower process limit, which are entirely defined by the data. You don't make those yourself. They're defined by the data. And what you need to know about this is when you have got those upper and lower limits, 99% of your data falls within those limits if everything is normal, if we're using common cause variation. So, sorry, I've just looked at the chat box and it made me giggle. So if there's nothing unusual going on in your system, 99% of the data will fall between your upper and lower limit. And so when something falls outside those limits or something changes, you can identify what it is. Now, if you are at all familiar with SPC, you'll know that there are rules. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. You need 15 to 20 data points to plot a robust SPC analysis. I think these days we'd say 15. I think when Sam wrote these slides, we were erring on the side of 20. It's a debate that's constantly ongoing, but 15 to 20 data points to make a robust analysis. Now, as I was saying, there are rules to help you interpret what's going on with your SPC. The first rule is really straightforward. Any point that falls outside your process limits is significant. That's statistically significant. It's outside the 99%. If you get two out of 3 points close to one of the limits, really near the top limit or really near the bottom limit, then that's also a warning that something statistically significant is changing in your system. The one we see most commonly in health service data is a shift. So you make a change in a process, or winter happens, and your process moves above or below the mean consistently for at least 7 points, or a run of points going up and down. So there are other rules, but these are the 4 which we find most helpful to use when you're analysing health service data. And we've got tools which will do this all for you automatically. Why 7 points? Well, 7 points because if you imagine tossing a coin once, you know the probability of getting one head is 50%. If you do it twice, it's 1 in 4. If you do it 7 times, the probability of getting 7 heads in a row, that's 7 points moving in the same direction or 7 points above the mean, well, the probability of that is the same as 1 in 128, about 0.8%. So that's why we say that's highly statistically significant. It's a rule of thumb, and if you're using very important life-critical data, you might want to go with 6 points. If you're using monthly data, you might want to go with 6 points, but on the whole, if you're using weekly data, you should at least wait for 7 points till you can say that something statistically significant has happened in your process. And what are we aiming for? Well, the advantage of statistical process control is it can show you real change. It can show you the impact of any intervention you made. This is one of our favourite charts because it's so clear and it's such a good advocate for this technique of representing your data. If you look at the beginning, we're looking at active recovery, times waiting for an active recovery from a hospital bed. So you can see at the beginning of the process, patients were waiting between about 3 and 8 days, on average 5.5 days. It was very variable, which makes the system very unpredictable and difficult to manage. They aligned some of their services, and you can see that immediately, as a result of the alignment, the variability was reduced, so patients waited between 2 and 5.5 days, and the mean was also reduced to around 4 days. And you can see the process was much better, much more stable, much less variable. This has been so successful, these chaps did it again, and they expanded their unit, and you can see the real difference that occurred. The mean was reduced to around 1 day, but most patients wait between 1.5 and 2.5 days, and the chart itself demonstrates that beautifully. So this is an annotated SPC chart, and this is a great way to demonstrate to anyone an improvement in your service. You can see that even the winter surge, which occurred towards the end of the last period, didn't manage to wreck their system. They had made a statistically valid, changed their service, and they could see the improvement. Really encouraging. That's our kind of gold standard graph. Now, SPC is particularly being used to look at improvement, and it's a good tool for that. But it's also really, really useful for assurance. If you have a graph like this, can you see that the target, which we would like to be above, is outside the process limits and above it? If you can all chat quickly and tell me, what would you say about this service? Is it going to meet its target? You're still chatting about food.
Yeah, I just need a minute to get the answers
right
through there. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, lots of no's. Okay, that's great. You're absolutely right. This system cannot achieve the target unless it's redesigned. It's just not capable of doing this. It's going to, 99% of the time, it's going to fall below the target. If the target line lay inside those limits, that's a different situation. And in that situation, it might sometimes achieve the limits, but not always. It might sometimes achieve the limits, but it's by chance, because anywhere within that band from the upper process limit to the lower process limit is chance. Right, so let's look at some real data. Another example of, well, this time a sea of red. What's hidden in the data? Well, it's true that the data is still red. This system is completely missing its target and is continuing to miss its target. However, what's hidden when you look at the data in that way is that there has been a real statistically significant improvement in the service. And instead of shouting at the person and saying, goodness me, this is no better, you're still failing the target, there is grounds for a celebration, because actually things are much, much better. You can see that the service has improved. It needs to improve some more, but there's real improvement, and that's hidden in the red line of data. And by plotting it on an SPC chart, you can see the improvement that's hidden. Now, I don't know, do you see these graphs? I see these graphs all the time here, and I really hate them. We call them spaghetti graphs. And again, they're hiding the data. You've got 3 years data there on a graph, all starting in the same month. And I guess that it's done to compare year on year. But how much more useful to do this? This is the same data over the same time period. And you can see immediately that there has been a real improvement in the number of serious incidents in this trust. And that's hidden in those 3 liney graphs. You might make a good guess at it, but actually when you display it on an SPC chart and highlight where there's special cause, and in particular improvement, you can see it so much more clearly.
Okay, so Alison, I'm just going to come to you for a moment. There seems to be a bit of a glitch. Karen's just lost her sound at the moment. Are you just able to pick up for us here, Alison, for a moment?
It'll take us a moment or two for Karen to come back. So where were we? So Karen is talking about knee-jerk reactions and what happens to the data. So let me just click through and see what happens next with this slide. Oh, it goes back to that one.
Best laid plans and all that, hey, Alison.
It was a really interesting point too.
It was indeed. We'll just see if we can pick up and fill this little bit of airspace for Karen while she tries to get a connection back.
I think the key point is that when we're looking at data, quite often it is easy to do that. You know, we look from month to month, and rather than looking at that longer term picture, which is really important. And that really is the take-home message from today, is not to look at those tiny changes that happen from month to month, but also put it into that wider context so we can see where the improvements are happening and where things are genuinely starting to improve, or where things are genuinely starting to deteriorate.
Okay, Alison, so we might need to go to plan B just for the moment, because I think Karen's just having a couple of technical problems. Which is your preference, Alison, so we can keep engaged with our audience at the moment? Because I know some of these slides are familiar to you, but not all. So would you like to hop ahead to your section, Alison? Will that work? Or should we just give Karen another couple of seconds? What would be your preference?
If we hop back to my bit, she can always kind of do I think Karen is getting onto the bit.
She's back. Excellent. Karen, we were doing the
shut us off the phone after an hour. Sorry about that.
So you just love technology. We have a very forgiving audience, and Karen's been a little treasure just trying to film a little bit in the background for you. So we'll just hop back to the slide where you were, Karen, because you've got people really interested in the point that you were just about to make. So you might need to just go backward a tiny little bit so you can pick up where you left off. Yeah, I think the ball's back with you now, Karen.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry about that.
There we go. Not a problem. Carry on. It's all yours.
Right. Okay, so we were talking about another example where we've got a measure that's really flip-flopping from red to green randomly. And I was going to show you this chart. So this is the one where the target line is inside the process limits. And it is random chance whether you hit the target or you don't hit the target. And we're terribly, terribly inclined to celebrate when things go well, even if it's just random chance. And you'll see here, this process did have a period where it didn't do very well, but it has gone back into special cause variation and is above the target. Right. Let me just make my slides work. I can't control the slides. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay, so there you go.
Okay,
working a bit of a lag.
Okay, strong evidence base. I didn't make this up, and neither did Sam. There's a very strong evidence base for using this sort of data in the health service. And one of the things which it was used for was actually identifying Harold Shipman, which is very interesting. There are lots of papers it would be worth you looking at. That's a particularly good one. The other thing which you might find really useful is, as a team, we have recently produced, in May this year, a document which is an interactive PDF which sits on the NHSI website called Making Data Count. It guides you through all of the stuff I've talked through. It shows you how to understand and interpret graphs. It gives you exercises to do with team members. It's just a great tool which we're very proud of and have really enjoyed using, and hope you enjoy using as well. So have a look at that. I'm sure that you'll be sent the link to Making Data Count. Hello? No, I can't move the slides. I'm sorry. Let's try that.
I think you've just got a bit of a lag on your side, Carrie.
Okay.
Just need to give it a couple of seconds to come through.
Okay, that's fine. So you can have a look at that. It's got lots of talking heads from both doctors and analysts, which is interesting. Exercises you can do, explanations of all the stuff we've talked about, examples of good graphs and bad graphs, and then there's a pledge sheet. And we've had lots of people pledging. You will have come across possibly the plot the dots hashtag. Sam's doing brilliantly at promoting all of the stuff we're talking about. And if you look in Making Data Count, the interactive PDF, you can find pledge sheets as well. And we'd be delighted to have your pledges about what you're going to do to use data better. We've got a new network which you can join, and you can join that on Source for Networks. And there you can see lots of conversations about using data, problems you might have with your data. It's a great platform to talk to other people about their journey towards SPC. And now I'm going to hand over to Alison.
Thank you very much, Karen. Just checking that you've got my audio and I'm not muted. Okay, thank you very much, Karen. I absolutely love the way that you've already talked about SPC and about common cause and special cause variation. Something that I want to talk about is the work that we've been doing within sustainable improvement, where we've been developing a framework, this visual that you see in front of you here, which is how do we support people using measurement, and how do we to be able to use that to understand large-scale programs of work. So things that, we work in a very complex industry, and even the simplest of improvement programs will often blur the edges between traditional healthcare and social care and the third sector. But also, we often are now more involved with using patient groups and just thinking in a very different way. So what we've been looking at is how do we start to bring together some of these more traditional approaches and use it in a way that allows us to understand what is a really complex system. before we get started, I thought I would talk to you a little bit about the three phases of measurement, which you may or may not be familiar with. So you will have heard of things like measuring for research, which is where we're trying to understand and quantify things that are new. So it might be a new treatment, it might be a new drug, a type of surgery, or even just a new pathway that we're looking at. And in research, we use very, very large amounts of data, very, very statistically controlled experiments, so that we can understand if the new thing that we're interested in is better than something that we've done before. You'll also be very familiar with, I'm more than certain, with measurement for accountability. This is where we're trying to use numbers to demonstrate whether or not we're achieving usually very specific targets, or whether we're achieving very specific standards. Quite often these things will run for years and years and years. We've got lots of targets that have been set maybe even 10 or 20 years ago. So these are things that, again, that we're very familiar with within the NHS. What we're not so familiar with is this measurement for improvement. And this is what Karen's been talking about today, where we're looking at data in a very different way. So what is different about measurement for improvement is that we don't typically need years and years and decades worth of data like we would do for accountability. We can certainly use some of that data, but we want to be looking at it very, very frequently. We want to be slicing it in a much more regular fashion than you might do for national targets. And it's also different from research in that we don't need very large sample sizes. We don't need these huge collections of data that maybe have thousands and thousands worth of participants. So if you're trying to make some improvement in either in your department or in your unit or in your hospital or trust or wherever you are in the world, you could be working in the other sectors, you don't need huge quantities of data. As Karen said, we're looking at somewhere between 15 to 20 data points, and you don't need to have huge numbers of people involved for this to work. So the great thing about statistical process control is that you can get started with this quite early on and get started with the process. So in terms of the Sustainable Improvement Impact Framework, what you can see in front of you is the process that we use to start using data to help understand the impact that a large programme of work can have on people, on the services that they use. So the first step, which we're not going to look at too much today, is where it's really important that you articulate what will change, how and why. And the reason that that's important is that we then use that to try and identify which measures are important to us. Now, when we start thinking about which measures are important to us, we have three broad types of measures. So we can have outcome measures, which are the voice of the patient. So what is the result? What has happened to the patient? Has it had a desired impact? Have they had a better outcome? Have they had a better experience? And it's all about how they feel and how their service has changed. We've also got process measures, which are the workings of the system. So are the parts of the system working as planned? So this might be the number of bed days. It might be the number of beds that you have in a unit. It could be the number of slots that you have in an operating theatre, for example. So that's very much the nuts and the bolts of the health and the care system that we have. And then we also think it's important to think about balancing measures. So these are things that maybe come in from the outside that might have an external influence on the things that we're interested in, or maybe they're unintended outcomes. So we're going to do a little exercise just to demonstrate this. So if the aim is to reduce waiting times in A&E, an example outcome measure would be something like patient satisfaction score. You'd expect that if people are seen within 4 hours, they would be a bit happier with that. I certainly don't want to spend a long time in A&E. A process measure would be the percentage of patients treated, admitted or discharged within 4 hours. This is a target that we're very familiar with. And then a balancing measure could be the percentage of patients who could have been treated at home or in primary care. So that's a balancing measure because there may be other things that are happening outside of accident and emergency that would cause those numbers to increase. So it might be a bank holiday, there may be some, maybe a local GP practice has closed and that's increased the number of patients who don't have anywhere else to go. So these are really important. So what we're trying to do here is look not just at one thing in isolation across the system, but we're trying to gather a collection of measures that allow us to see the wider picture that's part of the system. We're going to do a little quiz here. If you float your cursor to the left-hand side of your screen into the middle, you will see a funny little lozenge pops up, and it has the second icon down is a funny little squiggle. If you click on your squiggle, and then at the top left-hand bar that pops up, you should see an arrow pointer. I think you might have used these in some of the webinars that you've been looking at earlier. Yes, everybody's got it. So do we think that the number of, well ahead of me. So I don't even need to explain what this is, what is happening here. Either everybody's jumping on the bandwagon or you've got it. Absolutely. So the number of hospital beds available in your hospital is a process measure, because that's measuring the thing that's available in your hospital. It's measuring something, a structure or something that's happening within the service. So the friends and family test. Would you recommend this service to a friend or family member? Is it an outcome measure, a process measure, or a balancing measure? Absolutely, it's an outcome measure. We know that this is a really important and easy way for us to capture whether or not people think that the service that they've received is a good service. And we know that that is important. So the proportion of patients seen within 4 hours, do we think that this is an outcome measure, process measure, or a balancing measure?
They're good, this bunch, aren't they, Alison?
They're very good, absolutely on it. We're going to finish this nice and early, plenty of time for questions. So absolutely, it's a process measure. We've got one last one. The percentage of patients with 2 or more long-term health conditions. Absolutely. It's a balancing measure, because we know that the complexity of the patients that present to us in somewhere particularly like A&E can have a big impact on how long they're likely to stay within the system. Well done, everybody. Thank you very much. So what do we do? So we know about the 3 types of measures, but how do we then start using that to start to choose measures for a particular piece of work that we're trying to do within an improvement program? So we use a template like this, which allows us to help capture all of the different measures that we think are available for the things that we're interested in. So what we start off with is a description of our, we call it our theory of change, that first step within the big cog that I showed you, where we might have activities of things that we're trying to do. So we might be trying to increase the number of bed days, or not bed days, we don't want to increase bed days. We might be increasing the number of hospital beds, or it might be that we're trying to increase the number of slots within a specific unit. We might have outcomes, so we talked about the outcomes that relates to the patient or to the system. We might also have some goals or assumptions. So these are the things that we want to look at. So this is an example looking at if I'm trying to lose weight. So if I'm trying to lose weight, there are lots of things that I might want to do. So I might want to measure my weight. So we've got weight reduction. I might also want to reduce my number of alcohol units if I'm trying to improve my health. We might have some other measures around things like good diet and increased activity. So what we do is we list those on the left-hand side, and then we start to write down some measures that we think that might be appropriate to that. But within that, we then start so we write these long lists of measures going down. We then start to think about how important they are. So some things might be more important to your program than others. So if I'm trying to lose weight, then obviously weight loss is very important. Something like good diet might be less important to me. If I'm thinking about my health in general, then it's probably still important, but it's not as important as maybe losing weight. So it's really important to start thinking about your priorities. And then we've got two columns here, one which is the rationale, which is why would you choose the measure? And then you've got your issues or limitations, which are kind of like the cons, which is why might you not use that measure? And by listing all of this out, it then makes it much easier for us to understand which things we think are going to be suitable for our programme of improvement, which things we might want to prioritise, which things we might want to spend money on or time on collecting, which is really important. Now, a common question that I often get asked is, what do we do about the things which are harder to evidence? So sometimes there are things which maybe aren't as easy to quantify. And this is where we start to delve into the world of qualitative information, where we start to capture information from our patients or from our service users or from the people involved in delivering services, where we ask them questions and we capture that as free text or as responses. And there are two techniques that we use within sustainable improvement. We're not going to go into the details of that today, but just to let you be aware that there are two approaches. One is so one of the things that we find that's very hard to evidence is attribution. So if you're working in a system and if, for example, I say, well, I'm going to introduce a new smoking cessation program, but what do we know about the things that are genuinely encouraging people to reduce their smoking habit? Do we know that it's definitely down to that smoking cessation program, or do we think it's down to other things that are happening, like societal pressure, the increasing cost of cigarettes, maybe reduced availability of cigarettes in shops and things like that? So how do we know that we can attribute the work that we've done to the change that we've seen in the real world? So we use something called contribution analysis, which is a type of stakeholder analysis where we ask people who've been involved in the program to look or have been affected by the program to tell us were they aware of our particular program of work. So if we were looking at a smoking cessation program, you might say to a handful of people who have successfully quit their smoking, to say, were you aware of this smoking cessation program? Did you use it? Did it have a strong impact in terms of helping you stop smoking? So we use contribution analysis where we think attribution is important and where we think it might be difficult to untangle it from other things that might be working in the system. The other thing that we're interested in is unintended consequences. So unintended consequences are where other things in the world might happen that would impact the program that we're looking at. So if we're still working with the smoking cessation, imagine that there is a virus that affects tobacco production in one of the countries that's the major producer, and the cost of cigarettes goes absolutely through the roof, availability is restricted, and that might be something that also has an impact on smoking cessation. So this is where you might ask people about the most significant change. So there are unintended consequences, and it's just as useful to understand what's happening. So you might say, well, actually, it wasn't really our program that affected this, but we might be able to build on that in the future. Where this might work in other circumstances is where perhaps you've rolled out a program of work, you've made a change to your system, you've made a change to your service, and something happened that you weren't really quite expecting. So what you do is you ask your stakeholders, you ask them, what do you think was the most significant thing that happened? And they will tell you what they think was the most important thing that happened to them. I'm just going to kick over Edward Demi's. So the next thing that's important as part of our impact framework is to think about reviewing the data. So this, again, really does just build on everything that Karen's already been talking about today. So if you've got a handful of measures of things that you're interested in and you're measuring them with SPCs, something that's really important is that you should be reviewing your data, and not just reviewing your data within your team, but also sharing that information back with the stakeholders that are really important to you. And you need to be looking to find out whether or not progress is being made, are there any unexpected setbacks, and are there any areas which are not included in the data set that aren't currently covered that maybe should be covered going forward. And the reason that we say that it's important to review the data regularly is so that you can understand how progress is being made, so that if something perhaps isn't working, that you can then implement something new, you can then try something that will start moving your data in the right direction. So this is we talk about this as being the cog, about being the core process. We've got the 3 key steps that I've mentioned that it's really important to articulate what will change, how and why, that we put some measures into place and that we review that data on a regular basis, but that we do that on a very regular basis, that we start to do that in some cases every quarter, sometimes twice or every year, depending on the scale of the programme. And what that does is it allows you to make those adjustments as you're going through that large-scale change if you're looking at something that goes across several years. What we also find happens as a result of that is that we want to share the impact that we've had with others. And this is something that we've been very much focused on within our team, is how do we then start to communicate that? And that's a really important thing as well. So we focus very much on telling a story. Quite often, as Karen's been showing us today, people will communicate using very large, very difficult to interpret reports. And what we very much promote is making data much more accessible, making sure that the way that we present data is very visual. It may be that you just start to share with people your SPC charts. Because we know that that's a good way to show data. So it's really important to start thinking about telling a story, and rather than leaving it as a dry piece of information, to really start to use words to illustrate and bring that data to life. We know that that is absolutely critical, and not just using data, but also using qualitative information. You know, the stories that I talked about that we get from people, this qualitative information, it's really important to use the two together to really explain what's been happening in the real world. I'm just going to finish up by pulling up a slide which has a bunch of resources. I can see from the chat there that people are quite interested in contribution analysis. Contribution analysis isn't something that we within Sustainable Improvement have developed. This is something that is a tool that's been used very widely. So here are some resources that you can look to, and I think they're going into the chat box right now, so you can have a look at those. I think the main thing that I would very much recommend is that we've also got the Making Data Count guide there, and we've also got the Statistical Process Control tool. If you do one thing today, go and have a look at the SPC tool. It is absolutely brilliant. I love using it. I share it with my team, and we think it's absolutely brilliant, and of course it's free to use as well. I think that is everything from me. So I'm going to hand over to Elaine for questions. I can see there's been a ton of information popping up into the chat there, so I don't know if she's able to pull out any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alison and Karen. Fantastic that we got through that session very smoothly despite the technical issues that we had, so thank you. Yeah, there's been lots of conversation going on, and I think you've got some real advocates in the chat box, and Brian Cunningham, a real shout out to you, because you were picking up the pause point that we had when Karen's audio dropped, and we're kind of coming back to the points that Karen was making about the danger of looking at one data point at a time and saying, hey, look, it got better, and then just reacting to that when really you should be looking at the system over time. So Karen, I think you found a new friend in Brian, potentially. I don't know if you want to sort of come back on that at all, about the importance of not reacting to single data points. Okay, I think we might have just lost Karen again for the moment. Apologies, everybody. I think Karen's just having some technical issues in the office she's using today. Alison, do you want to pick up on that point about the dangers of focusing on single data points?
Yeah, I think there are lots of issues around single data points. And I think it's a cultural thing that we're starting to address. I know that Sam and Karen and the rest of her team have been doing lots of work with providers within their work within NHS Improvement. And it's something that we've been talking about as well within NHS England. So I think slowly but surely the message that, you know, single data points aren't really that helpful. And in fact, not just single data points, but also data that we also don't want to just focus on a single measure. That's the other thing. That's that's something that I very much was very keen to talk about today. That we can't look at a complex system and use a single number to try and explain what's happening. So it is really important that we start to use some of these brilliant tools that we've got here to start to tell a much more full story that we can see in the data.
Thank you. And I'm just going to come to Michael to see, Michael, have you picked up any other things that are coming through on chat?
No, I think we've covered most things off. There was a question about... Sorry, there's a large section of text between Elaine and different colleagues. An arrow being placed on the screen. And there was about resources for contribution analysis, and there was things about how do you determine data points. The only things that I picked out, really.
Okay, so I think there was another one that I picked up. Thanks, Michael. There's a question from Terry Betcher saying, any tips from the speakers today on determining data points? So just while we're trying to, Karen's actually come in on a different line, just trying to sort out her access to her sound at the moment. So Alison, whether you might want to just pick up on that one?
Sorry, can you just repeat that again, Elaine? I was just looking for a resource for contribution analysis.
No problem. So Kerry Betcher has put a little question in chat saying, do you have any tips on determining data points?
On determining data points, I think I need a little bit more clarity on what do you mean by that?
Okay, so Kerry, if we come back to you in chat maybe, if you just want to expand on your question, that would be really handy, and then we'll see whether Karen and or Alison can come back and help with that particular question for you. We're also getting people feeding back in chat, kind of just backing up what you were saying, Alison, in terms of the unintended consequences that can happen when you start to make what you think are improvements to a system, and the importance of those balancing measures. I think Anna Lund was saying changes in NHD, which I guess is an organisation, mental health and older people services have often impacted police services and social services.
Absolutely, and it is something that we've long known, and I think we've probably put that in the too hard box, and said, oh well, we don't really know what's happening outside of our service, so we'll just ignore it. But actually, I think by bringing, so when we talk about stakeholders, I know stakeholders is an overused term. When we talk about stakeholders or people who are involved in the programme of work, get people in from housing, get people in from local authorities, get people in from policing, because we know that they have just as big a stake in some of the things that we're trying to address as they do. So it is really important to understand that bigger picture. If you think about a boat that's floating on the surface of the sea, we know that waves will influence it. We know that the movement up and down will influence their location as well. So it's really, and that's what we're trying to do. I think maybe that was the question about determining a data point, is that we know that there's so many things that are influencing the thing that we're interested in, is that it can make measuring that thing and really tying it down to a single number really difficult. So what we do is we try and look at our problems, I think, from different perspectives, so we can start to see where things are moving in the right direction.
That's really helpful. And it'd be great, wouldn't it, Alison, to get a feel from the audience today as to the type of approaches that they're using to try and evidence their impact. Because I'm sure, we could draw on kind of the experience of everybody that we've got on the call today, given lots of folk are quite familiar with SPC CHOP. How are you guys kind of making sure that you can evidence the impact of your programmes, especially when they're large-scale change programmes that happen over much longer periods of time? It's much more emergent, so you can't necessarily plan ahead for it. It'd be great if you wanted to share with us in chat the types of approaches that you're using and how much of it kind of fits in with this impact framework model that Alison and team are using. Whilst people are just thinking about that question, Brian's just come in, Alison, and said it would be nice to see some deeper discussion of the cultural or mindset aspects of measurement, such as how the current culture reacts to red, yellow, green, and measurement over time. That's a fantastic question. Alison, what are you experiencing when you work with teams across the country? What's that cultural mindset to the red, yellow, and green?
I think Karen's probably better situated to comment on that, actually. Because we are usually working within programs of people that we're working within programs where people are already, they're asking for our help so that they already know a little bit about large-scale change and about the kind of work that we do. But I think that the work that Karen does, that might not be the case. Would that be fair? I don't know if Karen's back online.
We seem to have real problems getting Karen back on audio at the moment, unfortunately. So
okay.
It's via me, Alison. Filling in for Karen at the minute. Oh, you're back. Karen, fantastic. I have no idea what's going with your audio, but hey, brilliant.
No, I don't know. You fixed that. I didn't. We're working with boards all over the country who use RAG rating as a standard way of looking at their data. We've now done 25 boards, talking to the chief execs and the non-exec directors and sometimes the analysts. And what we find is they're very comfortable with a red, amber, green representation of their data. But when you show them something better, our experience has been that the appetite is amazing. We have been to, as I said, about 20 boards. We have seen 5 of them already transform their board reports within weeks of us going. And the one I went to last week have moved a substantial amount towards that already. So they're already using SPC in their data. They're using some icons which indicate whether variables in special cause or common cause, and whether that's good or bad, and something about assurance as well. So we've seen a huge appetite for change towards this, and we think there's more of a problem than there actually is, which is amazing.
That's really interesting, Karen. It'd be great to expand on that a bit more. I had a comment come in the chat. Oh my gosh, it's whizzing up again. Hang on, let me just grab the comment back I was going to refer to. Chat sometimes moves at a very fast rate. Kerry Betcher's saying the whole problem with the red, amber, green presentation is that she thinks it prevents people from being curious about what's really happening.
Well, it prevents them from being curious. Sometimes, as we've looked at, it completely conceals it, which is dangerous for everybody concerned. And I think it stops people thinking. You need to think about your service. So when we do a statistical process control chart and we can see significance in any measure, what you're meant to do is go and think about that. Go and find out why. And so we're encouraging analysts who produce these charts to then go and talk to the service manager and says, what happened at the beginning of December that caused this change? Do you know what it was? Is it a good change? Is it a bad change? Can we sustain it? And so you need to be really curious. I think a red, amber, green sort of lulls you into a false sense of security, and you go, oh yeah, boring, boring, boring. But actually, there's amazing stuff going on underneath the surface, and we want to celebrate the good. We want to stop the bad, and we want to understand our data.
That's incredible. And I think it's opened up a whole chain of conversation now. So Philip Tomerlin put a comment in chat saying that he's keen to see RAG use restricted to just risk assessment. Everything else is either on track, delivering or not. And he's got a question mark against that. And just before you pick up on that, there's been some sort of supplementary chat on the back of that one, was Lena saying, and even risks in reality, how seriously or closely does anybody take it, with Emily saying, actually in honesty, not seriously. As long as they're green, sadly, we don't really take that much notice, even with risk management. What would be your reaction to that, Karen?
Yes, I think you're right. I think we don't react strongly enough to this, and boards certainly don't. Because your system could be in common cause variation, nothing is changing, and it is completely incapable of reaching the target. And so it will either remain red or green, but you need to react to that. If the system is red, you need to know whether it's actually improving, because unless you change that system, if your target lies outside your control limits, nothing will make it succeed. You have to redesign your system, and you have to be aware of what's really going on.
I think that's the key from what you've both been sharing with us today, isn't it? It's about using that data really intelligently to understand what's going on around here, and where interventions are taking place, and the effect of those interventions on your system.
Yeah, I think analysts should be allowed to go and talk to doctors and service managers and find out what's really going on. It makes their job more interesting and their reporting far more relevant.
Absolutely. And Karen, it'd be helpful if you could just share with folk a little bit more about the FBC tools that you have. Alison mentioned in chat while you were doing your fab presentation that the tools are really amazing because you don't actually need to be an analyst and understand all kind of how all the data works and the formulas. The tool does that for you and allows you to then get on with the important work about understanding what's happening. Do you just want to share with people what's available in terms of resources and how it kind of works?
Well, they sit on the NHSI website, so you can help yourselves to them. I've designed them really originally to be used by nurses on wards, so that all they had to do is literally type in a number for each week or each day. Having set up, you can say what the title for your graph is, you can say what you're measuring, and you can then indicate the timescale you're measuring across. And then you just have to literally type in your measurement day by day. It just works beautifully to produce an SPC chart, and it just produces a run chart until you get to 15 data points. When you get to 15 data points, it converts it into an SPC chart, and it gives you some sort of commentary that says something like, this system is in special cause because there's a run of points above the mean, or you've got an extreme value that you need to go and investigate. So it's very, very simple to use. So we've got that one. We've got the Pareto chart, which allows you to look at, so that's the sort of thing you'd be using with the red and green days, red to green. And it'll count for you the number of occurrences by, so if you have a number of reasons for delay, it will give you a Pareto chart, which is a ranked bar chart with a line over the top that tells you how important. So we've got that tool. We've got a rare events tool. We've got a bit more technical, an SPC P-chart tool, which you might want if you're very technical. And we've also got something called a funnel plot, which lets you look at a single moment in time what's going on in a number of different systems. So I've designed them, they're my babies, and I try to make them as useful as possible for everyone. And I you know, if you pick them up and use them and have any feedback, I'd be delighted to hear.
That's fabulous. Thanks, Karen. And how best would you like people to get in touch with you? I'm just going to remind people about the collaboration space at the moment so we can get engaging with you through our collaboration space for the Virtual Academy, Karen. Will that be fine, or would you like people to get in touch with you in a different way?
Or if you look in Making Data Count, we have a team email address which you can use.
That's super. Thank you so much.
Can I just quickly pick on the point that the question that Mandy raised, and who then put a little bit of further clarity about looking at determining how many balancing measures, how you would determine how many balancing measures. The short answer to that is it depends. The slightly longer answer to that is about just being pragmatic. There isn't a rule of thumb as such, but just think about making sure that you have a clear understanding about the resources and the time and the money spent collecting that information. So wherever possible, we always try and keep the balancing measures as easy and as cheap to collect as possible. But if you use the template and to think about how important those balancing measures are, there might be some that have a very strong impact on your system, on the thing that you're trying to improve. So just think about that, and that will tell you. But try and keep it. I would encourage to have at least one, but you might need maybe 2, 3, or even 4, depending on the size of your system and the program of work area, I'm afraid. I don't know if that answers that question. So I just thought I'd quickly drop that in before we hand back to Elaine.
Thank you. That's brilliant. So we literally are coming up to the bottom of the hour. We always promise to finish on time. So huge thanks to Alison and Karen. And Karen, huge round of applause for your first ever webinar. I think you did a brilliant job, despite the phone throwing you out of your room. Lots of really great conversations stimulated in the chat box, and really good to get that conversation going about the cultural aspects, which I think is really critical around all of this. So huge thanks from us, and thank you to the audience for being so interactive as always. Quick reminder about the collaboration space. So you can access the recordings from today's session and access the slides, etc., and engage with Karen and team through the collaboration space. So if you haven't joined, please do so, and you can use the Virtual Academy inbox if you have any problems to let us know, and we can help you out there. And finally, just to let you know, next Thursday, our last webinar will be on creating and managing a network. That will run on the 13th of December, 12:30 to 1:30. So please do register to join us if you possibly can. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.